Racist manager fires a black employee, not knowing he's the CEO's son. The office was silent. The smell of coffee hung thick in the air. Everyone had stopped talking when the door to the manager's office opened. A man walked out, his face red, shaking with anger. His suit was too tight, and his fists clenched as he walked past the employees sitting at their desks. They all watched, their faces full of confusion, but no one dared to speak. The manager's voice echoed in their minds. "You're fired. Get out of my sight. Now." The employee, a black man named David, stood frozen at the door, his mouth open in shock. His eyes were wide, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. How could this be happening? The words hung in the air like an unbearable weight. But David was no ordinary employee. He was the son of the CEO, a man who had built this company from the ground up. The CEO, known for his calm and collected demeanor, had always encouraged equality, respect, and hard work. The manager had no idea who David was. The only thing he saw was the color of David's skin. David had always kept his identity secret. He preferred to work on his own, away from the privileges of being the CEO's son. It made his job easier, and he liked to prove himself. But today, everything had changed. The manager, a man named Mr. Thompson, had crossed a line. David wasn't going to let it slide. He turned to face Mr. Thompson, his anger rising like a fire. "I think you've made a big mistake," David said, his voice low but firm. The manager blinked in surprise. "A mistake?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" "Nothing." David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had one message for the manager. "I'm not just any employee. I'm the CEO's son." The manager's face drained of color as his jaw dropped. He looked around the office, his eyes darting nervously. The employees were watching, whispering among themselves. Some of them had already guessed who David was, but the manager had no idea. David stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Mr. Thompson. The tension in the room was palpable. No one knew what was going to happen next. "Do you want to take back your words?" David asked, his voice calm, but filled with authority. The manager opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to process the situation. David could see the panic in his eyes. The man was realizing the magnitude of his mistake, but it was too late now. David sent a quick text to his father. It didn't take long before his phone buzzed with a reply. David's heart pounded as he read the message. "I'm on my way." He smiled, knowing his father would take care of the rest. The manager was about to face the consequences of his actions, and David would make sure of that. But just as David was about to walk out of the office, the door opened again. This time, it was the CEO himself, his tall figure filling the doorway. The entire office stood still, as if time had frozen. Everyone knew what was about to happen. David's father stepped into the room, his gaze locked on Mr. Thompson. The manager's face turned pale as he looked up at the CEO, realizing the truth at last. Before anyone could say a word, the CEO spoke, his voice cold and commanding. "You're fired." David watched as the manager's knees buckled, his face twisting in disbelief. It was over. There was no turning back now. But even as the manager tried to protest, the CEO remained unshaken, his eyes never leaving the man who had disrespected his son. The office was silent again, except for the sound of the manager's pleading voice, growing fainter with every word. David felt a mix of emotions, anger, satisfaction, and a strange sense of justice. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. There was more to come, more to uncover, and more to be revealed. What had happened today was just the beginning. The manager's downfall was inevitable, but the story was far from over. David turned and walked away, his steps purposeful. The CEO's son had spoken, and now the consequences would unfold. David sat in his car, staring out at the office building. He could still hear the manager's voice in his head, still see the disbelief in his eyes. The world outside seemed so quiet, so normal, but inside, everything had changed. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his father. "Meet me at the office tomorrow. We need to talk." David's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what his father wanted to discuss, but he knew it wouldn't be just about the firing. There was something bigger, something more serious behind it all. He parked his car in front of his apartment building and stared at the text for a few more moments. His mind raced with questions, but for now, there was only one thing he was sure of. The manager's actions had set something in motion, and David wasn't going to let it stop. Tomorrow would be the day everything came to light. The sun was barely up, and the streets outside were still quiet as David made his way into the office the next day. The early morning haze seemed to match the uncertainty he felt inside. As he parked his car and stepped out, his mind raced, thoughts of the firing and the conversation that was sure to follow swirling in his head. He hadn't heard from his father since the night before, and the anticipation made him anxious. The building stood tall in front of him, its glass windows reflecting the orange glow of the morning light. It was a familiar sight, but today felt different. There was a weight in the air, something David couldn't quite put his finger on. He glanced at the entrance, seeing the security guards at their posts. They nodded politely, but David's mind was elsewhere as he passed them and walked through the revolving doors. He hadn't made it far into the lobby when he saw his father. The CEO, tall and imposing as always, stood near the elevator, talking to one of the senior managers. David hesitated for a moment, then approached. "Dad," David called softly, and his father turned, his face lighting up when he saw him. "David," the CEO said with a warm smile, but David could sense the tension in his voice. It wasn't the usual calm tone he was used to hearing. "I'm glad you're here. We need to talk." David nodded, following his father into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft chime, and the ride-up was quiet, save for the sound of the elevator's soft hum. They reached the CEO's office floor in a matter of seconds, and David was the first to step out. He followed his father down the long corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. They reached the large, glass-walled office, and the CEO motioned for David to take a seat. The office was pristine, with its sleek furniture and large desk covered only with a few important papers. The view from the windows overlooked the city, the vast expanse of buildings stretching out into the horizon. Once they were seated, the CEO leaned forward, his expression serious. "David, I need you to listen carefully," he began. "What happened yesterday, it was necessary, but there are things happening behind the scenes that you don't know about." David frowned. "What do you mean, Dad?" His father sighed, a rare sign of worry crossing his face. "Mr. Thompson's actions were just one part of a much bigger issue. There's been a pattern of discrimination in this company for years, David. I've tried to deal with it quietly, but now it's reached a point where I can't ignore it anymore." David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Discrimination? But what does that have to do with me? The CEO looked at him, his eyes softening. "You've always kept your identity hidden, David. You've done well to prove yourself through hard work, not relying on the privileges of your last name. But yesterday, that man, he couldn't see past your skin color. And it's not just him. There are others in the company who share his views, people who think like him." David's mind reeled. He had suspected that things weren't always as fair as they seemed, but hearing his father say it out loud made everything more real. "So what now? What are we going to do about it?" The CEO leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "We're going to expose it. We're going to root out the racism that has been hiding in plain sight. But it won't be easy. There are powerful people involved, people who will stop at nothing to protect their position." David swallowed hard. He'd never imagined it would be this serious. His father was known for his level-headed approach, never one to make rash decisions, but now David saw a side of him he hadn't witnessed before, a side that was ready to fight back. "But, Dad," David began, "if we go public with this, it could destroy the company, everything you've worked for. Is it really worth it?" The CEO's expression softened as he looked at his son. "Sometimes, David, doing the right thing comes with a price. But if we don't stand up now, things will only get worse. We've worked hard to build this company, but we've also built it on a foundation of fairness. If that's not what we stand for, then everything we've done will mean nothing." David sat back, absorbing his father's words. He understood the gravity of the situation now. It wasn't just about one racist manager. It was about the entire culture of the company, the deep-seated prejudices that had festered for years without anyone daring to confront them. "What do you need me to do?" David asked, his voice steady now. His father looked at him, his gaze intense. "I need you to help me expose the truth. You've got a lot of connections here, David, and your position as an employee gives you a unique perspective. But we need to be careful. If we move too fast, we could lose everything." David nodded, feeling a surge of determination. This wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about changing an entire system, about making sure that no one would ever again be treated the way he had been by Mr. Thompson. As they discussed the plan further, David felt the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. But with his father by his side, he knew they could make a difference. They had to. Later that day, David walked back to his desk, his mind still spinning. His phone buzzed with a new message, and he quickly pulled it out of his pocket. It was from his father. "Meet me in the conference room in 1 hour. We need to strategize." David's heart skipped a beat. Something was about to happen, something big. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he knew that the wheels were already in motion, and there was no turning back now. As he walked toward the conference room, David caught sight of Mr. Thompson across the hall. The manager's face was pale, his movements stiff as he walked past the employees. David could see the unease in his eyes, and a small part of him felt satisfaction. The manager had made a mistake, and now he was going to have to live with the consequences. But just as David was about to enter the conference room, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from someone else. It was a warning that would change everything. David's heart raced as he stared at the message on his phone. It was from an unknown number, the message short and to the point. "Watch your back. There are people who don't want this getting out. Be careful." David's mind went into overdrive. Who could this be? Was it someone from the company? A coworker, or perhaps even one of the people his father had been talking about, the ones who didn't want the truth exposed? He glanced at the conference room door, a knot forming in his stomach. He had come so far already. The plan to confront the corruption at the company was in motion, but now, this new message made him question everything. What if his father was right about how dangerous this would become? What if the people behind the scenes were far more powerful than he had thought? His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his father. "Get to the conference room. We need to finalize our plan." David took a deep breath, tucking his phone back into his pocket. There was no turning back now. He couldn't back out. His father had already made up his mind, and David couldn't let him face this battle alone. He squared his shoulders, walking confidently toward the door. He had to trust his father's judgment. They would expose the truth together. As David entered the conference room, the air felt thick with tension. His father was already there, along with a few senior members of the team, people David had worked with for years but never truly known. They were the ones who would help with the exposure, but David couldn't shake the feeling that some of them might be just as deep in the company's secret world of prejudice as Mr. Thompson had been. "David, come in," his father said as he saw him enter. The CEO looked calm, but there was an edge to his voice. His eyes flickered to David for just a moment, then back to the others at the table. David took a seat, his mind still spinning with the warning he had just received. The CEO began outlining the plan in detail. They would gather evidence, statements from employees, footage, any documents that could prove the widespread discrimination. It was all going to come out in one big push. But David couldn't shake the unease in his gut. They talked for what felt like hours, and as the meeting came to an end, David felt both exhausted and strangely empowered. This wasn't just about one man losing his job. This was about shaking the very foundation of the company. If they succeeded, it could lead to a total overhaul of how things were run, maybe even a complete restructuring of the management team. If they failed, however, everything they had worked for could crumble. As David walked out of the conference room, he had a feeling that something wasn't right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the tension was palpable. People were watching him, but he didn't know if they were on his side or not. The unknown message from earlier was still haunting him. Just as he was about to reach his desk, he saw Mr. Thompson again. This time, the manager's eyes met his with a cold stare, and there was something unsettling in the way Mr. Thompson watched him. David couldn't read his expression, But there was no mistaking the animosity in the man's gaze. David's phone buzzed once more, and he pulled it out quickly. The message was from his father. Don't trust anyone. There's a leak in the company. We don't know who, but someone is feeding information to the other side. David's stomach dropped. A leak? How could that be possible? Was someone on the inside working against them? He quickly typed a reply. What do we do? The response came swiftly. We move forward, but be careful. We have to find out who the leak is before it's too late. David felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked around the office, his mind racing. Who could he trust? The people who had been in the meeting seemed genuine, but one of them could be the person feeding information to the enemy. And who were the enemy, exactly? Who else was involved in this shadowy world of racism and corruption within the company? Just then, David felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned around to see Emma, a co-worker who had always been friendly and reliable. She was smiling, but there was something off about the way she was looking at him. Hey, David, she said, her voice light. Everything okay? You seem a little distracted. David hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to trust her. She had always been kind, but could she be part of this secret group within the company? The doubt lingered in his mind. Still, he didn't want to show any signs of suspicion. Yeah, everything's fine, David replied, forcing a smile. Just a busy day. Emma nodded, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me, right? David nodded. Thanks, Emma. I'll keep that in mind. As she walked away, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The message from his father, the warning about a leak. Everything was starting to feel like a puzzle with missing pieces. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to look next. That afternoon, as David sat at his desk, he was interrupted by an unexpected phone call. The number wasn't familiar, but he answered it anyway, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the phone to his ear. Hello, David said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. You're in danger, David. They know what you're planning. David's heart skipped a beat. Who is this? The voice didn't answer directly. You have to stop. Back off, or you'll regret it. You don't know who you're dealing with. Before David could respond, the line went dead. He sat there, staring at the phone, his mind reeling. Was this another warning? Who was behind this? And why was someone trying to scare him? He looked around the office, his gaze falling on the people closest to him. Could any of them be involved in what was happening? Was Emma connected to this in some way? David took a deep breath. One thing was certain. Things were getting more dangerous by the minute. He had to find out who was behind all this, and fast before it was too late. David sat frozen for a moment, the weight of the phone call heavy in his hands. The line had gone dead before he could ask any more questions, but the message was clear. Someone knew what he and his father were planning, and they wanted him to back off. But that wasn't going to happen. David had already made up his mind. He couldn't stop now, no matter what threats were thrown his way. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly time for his meeting with his father. They had to keep moving forward. There was no time to dwell on the cryptic phone call or the possible leak within the company. David knew he had to focus on the task at hand, exposing the truth and taking down the system of racism that had been allowed to fester for far too long. As he walked to his father's office, the halls seemed unnaturally quiet. David's footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, and a chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled him, it was the feeling that he was being watched. Every corner he turned, every door he passed, felt like an opportunity for someone to step out of the shadows. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the people he'd known for years. When he reached the CEO's office, he found his father standing by the window, looking out over the city below. The CEO turned when he heard David enter, his face showing the same calm, composed expression that David had always admired. But today, there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. The weight of the situation had clearly taken its toll. David, his father greeted, his voice steady, but laced with concern. I trust you received my message? David nodded, taking a seat across from him. Yes. But things are getting more complicated. I received another warning today. The CEO's brow furrowed. What kind of warning? David quickly recounted the phone call he had received earlier, leaving out no details. His father listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each passing word. It's happening sooner than I thought, the CEO said after a long pause. We've underestimated how deep this runs within the company. But we can't back down now. We need to act quickly before it's too late. David nodded, his resolve hardening. What's the next step? His father leaned forward, his eyes fixed on David's. We're going to gather everything we've got, employee testimonies, any leaked emails, anything that can prove the discrimination we know exists. But we have to be careful. Whoever is behind this is watching us. We can't afford to make a single mistake. David's phone buzzed, interrupting the conversation. He pulled it out and saw that it was a message from Emma. Can you meet me after work? I need to talk to you about something important. David hesitated. Could he trust Emma? She seemed genuine, but there was that nagging feeling in the back of his mind telling him that something wasn't quite right. He looked at his father, who gave him a subtle nod. Go meet her, the CEO said. But be cautious. Don't let your guard down. David agreed, standing up to leave. He wasn't sure what Emma wanted to talk about, but if she had information about what was going on, he couldn't afford to ignore it. As he walked out of his father's office, David's mind was filled with questions. Was Emma involved in the leak? Was she trying to warn him? Or was she part of the conspiracy? His instincts told him to be careful, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma might be the key to unraveling everything. The rest of the day dragged on. David couldn't focus on his work, his mind constantly returning to the meeting with Emma. The office was full of people going about their business, but David felt like he was in a different world. He was no longer just an employee. He was someone caught in a dangerous game of deception and power. Finally, the workday ended, and David drove to the cafe where he had arranged to meet Emma. The small, dimly lit cafe was nearly empty when he arrived, the only other patrons a couple of quiet regulars sitting by the window. David found a table near the back and waited, his nerves on edge. Emma arrived a few minutes later, her face tense. She spotted David immediately and walked over to him, her usual smile absent. She sat down without saying a word, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her jacket. Emma, David said, trying to keep his voice calm. What's going on? You said you needed to talk. She looked up at him, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I know what's happening, she said quietly. I know what you and your father are planning. And I have to warn you. There are people here who won't stop until they destroy you. David's heart pounded. What are you talking about? Emma leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. I'm not part of the group that's trying to stop you. But I know who is. There are people within this company, high up, who are involved in something bigger than what you realize. This isn't just about racism, it's about power. And if you keep going down this road, you'll put yourself in danger. David felt a wave of confusion and disbelief wash over him. Who are these people? Why are they doing this? Emma hesitated, looking around nervously before continuing. I can't say too much, but I'll help you. I'll give you what I know, but you have to promise me that you'll be careful. Don't trust anyone, not even me. Not right now. David's mind was spinning. He had no idea who to trust anymore. Everyone seemed to have an agenda, and everyone had secrets. Emma seemed genuine, but was she being honest, or was she part of the web of lies? He nodded slowly. I'll be careful, but you have to give me something. What do you know? Emma took a deep breath and pulled out a small envelope from her bag. She slid it across the table to David, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside this, she said softly, is a list of names. People who are involved in this network of corruption. You need to act fast, David. Time is running out. David picked up the envelope, his hands shaking as he held it. Thank you, Emma. This could be the breakthrough we need. She nodded, standing up to leave. But before she turned to go, she stopped and looked back at him. David, remember what I said, she warned. Don't trust anyone. Not even me. As Emma disappeared into the night, David sat alone at the table, his mind racing. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, like it contained the answer to everything. But as he looked around the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Was someone following him? Was someone always a step ahead? David stood up, slipping the envelope into his coat pocket. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for certain. He was in the fight of his life, and the stakes had never been higher. David's mind raced as he walked back to his car, the envelope burning a hole in his pocket. Emma's warning echoed in his mind, "Don't trust anyone. Not even me." The weight of her words seemed to follow him, intensifying with every step he took. He had to know what was inside the envelope, but there was no way he could open it in public. He needed to get home, to have privacy, to make sense of whatever Emma had given him. His car seemed miles away as he walked through the empty streets. The sound of his footsteps was the only noise, the usual city hum now a distant memory. Every corner he turned, every shadow he passed, seemed to hide someone waiting for him, watching him. The unease in his chest grew with each passing moment. Had he been followed? Was someone lurking in the dark? When David finally reached his car, he glanced around quickly before getting in. He locked the doors, his breath coming faster than usual. The envelope was still in his pocket, untouched, but it felt like a ticking time bomb. What could be inside? Who were the people Emma was warning him about? And why was she so sure he couldn't trust anyone, even her? He started the engine and drove home, taking the long way to make sure he wasn't being followed. The streets were quiet, the city winding down for the night, but his thoughts were anything but calm. The entire situation was becoming more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. What started as an attempt to expose racism within the company had spiraled into something much bigger, something that seemed to go far beyond the walls of his office. Finally, when he got to his apartment, David locked the door behind him and sat down at the kitchen table. He reached for the envelope, his hands trembling. Slowly, he slid it open, not knowing what he might find. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with a list of names, as Emma had promised. David's eyes scanned the list quickly. There were at least a dozen names, all of them employees within the company. But what shocked him even more were the positions listed next to each name. These weren't just low-level employees or managers. These were people in key positions, senior executives, department heads, and even board members. People who had the power to control the flow of information, to bury the truth, to protect the status quo. He sat back in his chair, the paper still in his hands. The names were familiar, some of them people he had worked with directly. Others were figures he had only seen in passing, high-ranking individuals who made decisions far above his pay grade. The thought that any of them could be involved in something this sinister made him sick to his stomach. But there was more. At the bottom of the list was a single name that made David's blood run cold. His father's name. David's heart stopped. He stared at the paper, blinking, unsure if he was seeing things correctly. His father? How could that be? His father had always been the epitome of fairness, of doing the right thing. He couldn't possibly be involved in any of this. But the evidence was right in front of him. Could this be a mistake? Was it possible that someone had planted his father's name on the list to set him up? Or worse, was his father actually part of this network of corruption? David's mind raced. He stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of everything. He had to confront his father, but how could he even begin to ask him about something like this? If his father had been involved in any way, it would change everything. The trust between them, built over years of working together, would be shattered in an instant. And if he wasn't involved, if someone was framing him, then David needed to figure out who was behind it before it was too late. His phone buzzed, cutting through his thoughts. David grabbed it, half expecting another warning. But this time it was a message from his father. "We need to talk. Meet me at the office in 30 minutes. David's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Why did his father want to meet so urgently? Was this about the names on the list? Or was it something else entirely? He didn't have time to think about it. He quickly grabbed his jacket, the list of names still clenched tightly in his hand. He had no idea what his father was going to say when they met, but he couldn't ignore this anymore. The answers were out there, and he was determined to get to the truth, no matter where it led. The office was eerily quiet when David arrived, the hallways lit only by the soft glow of overhead lights. He could feel the tension in the air, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The silence seemed to press down on him, making the normally familiar space feel like a maze of shadows and secrets. David made his way to his father's office, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. When he reached the door, he knocked, and his father's voice called out from inside. "Come in." David stepped inside, and his father stood up from behind the desk, his expression unreadable. There was something different about him tonight, something more guarded, more distant. For the first time in David's life, he felt like he was facing a stranger, not the man who had always been there for him. "I got your message," David said, his voice steady despite the storm raging. The CEO looked at him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, he sat back down in his chair and motioned for David to sit. "David, we've been going about this the wrong way. The company, everything we've worked for, it's not what we thought it was. I've been trying to protect you from the truth, but now I can't anymore." David felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean? What truth?" The CEO hesitated, his hands resting on the desk in front of him. "I've been part of something bigger than I ever realized. Something I never should have been involved in. And now it's all coming to a head. I don't know who you can trust, David, but I need you to listen carefully. There's a lot more going on than just racism. There are people in this company who are willing to do anything to protect their power, no matter who gets hurt in the process." David's mind was spinning. His father's words were like a punch to the gut. "Are you telling me you're involved in this? In the corruption? In the racism?" The CEO looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know it had gone this far. But now that I do, I have to help you take it down. I'm with you, David. But you need to understand something. It's not just the company at risk. It's your life." David felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. His father was admitting to something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. But it was clear now, this wasn't just a fight against racism. This was a fight for survival. David stood there, his mind struggling to catch up with his father's confession. The room felt smaller somehow, suffocating even, as the weight of his father's words sank in. The company, the life he'd known for so long, was built on a foundation that wasn't as solid as he'd believed. His father had been hiding something dark, and now it was all unraveling before him. David's voice was barely a whisper. "What exactly are you saying? Are you admitting that you're part of this corruption?" The CEO's face was lined with regret, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as he stared at the desk. "No, David. I didn't know the extent of it. I never wanted you to be involved. I try to protect you from it. But now that it's out in the open, I can't pretend I didn't see the signs. I've been so focused on keeping the company afloat, on maintaining the image, that I turned a blind eye to the things happening under the surface." David felt a tight knot form in his chest. "So you knew? You knew about the racism, the corruption, and you did nothing?" His father's eyes met his, pain and shame in them. "I didn't know it was this bad. I thought it was just a few rogue individuals, a few bad apples. I never imagined that it was this deep, that it was systematic. But now I realize the truth. People at the top, people we trust, they're part of this, and they've been controlling the narrative for years." David took a deep breath, trying to process what his father was telling him. "And what are we supposed to do now? What's the plan? You said you wanted to help me take it down, but how?" The CEO stood up, walking to the window, as if searching for the right words. "We're not alone in this, David. I've been talking to some of the other executives, the ones who are still loyal to the company's original mission. We have a few allies, but they're in hiding. The network we're up against is vast. They control not only the company, but also the public perception. If we go after them head-on, it will destroy everything we've built." David clenched his fists. "So, what are you saying? We let them win?" "No," the CEO said quickly, turning around to face David. "We can't let them win. But we need a strategy. We have to expose them carefully, methodically. We have to gather more evidence, proof that they've been manipulating the system for their own benefit. But we also need to find the leak. If we don't stop the leak, they'll know everything before we can act." David felt the weight of his father's words press down on him. The leak, the person who was tipping them off. It was like the puzzle pieces were finally starting to come together. He had suspected someone was feeding information to the other side, but now it was clear. The fight was bigger than he had ever imagined. "Who do you think it is?" David asked, his voice low. "Who's leaking the information?" The CEO shook his head. "I don't know. But it's someone close to us. Someone with access to everything we're doing." David sat down heavily, feeling the exhaustion of the past few days crashing over him. This is a mess. We can't trust anyone, not even the people we thought we could. "We have to be careful," his father replied, his tone hardening. "The moment we make a move, everything will change. There will be no going back. If we do this wrong, they'll come after us." David looked at the envelope Emma had given him, still tucked in his jacket pocket. The names on the list, the people he had known, the faces he had trusted. All of them were now suspects. Was one of them the leak? Could someone he had worked alongside for years be betraying them? Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. David quickly pulled it out, expecting another message from Emma, but instead, it was from an unknown number. He opened the message, his heart pounding. "You're getting too close, David. If you keep digging, you won't make it out alive. Stop while you still can." David's hand shook as he read the message. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a threat. He showed the message to his father, who read it and sighed deeply. "It's starting, David," the CEO said quietly. "They know we're coming for them. And they won't stop until we're silenced." David's mind raced. Who was behind this? Who would go to such lengths to protect their secrets? Whoever it was, they were dangerous. But that only fueled David's resolve. He couldn't back down now, not when the stakes were this high. "I'm not stopping," David said, his voice firm. "We're going to finish this. I'll find the leak, and I'll expose them. We'll take this company back." The CEO nodded, his eyes filled with determination, but also fear. "Just remember, David, this isn't just about the company anymore. This is about your life. And I won't let them destroy you." David nodded, his mind already working through the next steps. They had to move quickly. The longer they waited, the more dangerous it would become. The enemy was closing in, and they couldn't afford to waste time. As David stood up to leave, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from Emma. "Meet me tonight. I have more to tell you. Be careful, they know about you." David's heart skipped a beat. Who were they? Was it the people who had been sending him threats? Or was Emma talking about someone else? Either way, he had no choice. He had to meet her. He had to find out what she knew, what she could tell him. But as he walked out of his father's office, his mind was clouded with doubt. The game had changed. Everything he thought he knew was slipping through his fingers, and every move he made seemed to bring him closer to a trap. He was getting closer to the truth, but with every step, the danger grew. That night, as David drove to the meeting with Emma, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every turn he made, every stoplight he passed, he glanced in his rearview mirror, expecting to see a shadow tailing him. But the streets were empty. The night seemed calm. Yet something deep inside told him it wasn't over. He had no idea who to trust anymore, but one thing was certain. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous the game became. And soon, the consequences of his choices would be felt by everyone around him. The moment of reckoning was coming, and David was about to walk right into the lion's den. David's pulse quickened as he neared the cafe where he was supposed to meet Emma. The streets around him were eerily quiet, and his headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows along the road. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, even though the streets seemed empty. Every car that passed felt like it could be following him, and every turn he made was calculated. The thought of being trailed made his stomach twist with unease. When he finally arrived, he parked his car in a quiet spot and quickly scanned the area. The cafe's warm lights flickered in the distance, casting a welcoming glow, but tonight, David wasn't looking for comfort. He was on edge, wondering what Emma had to tell him. What could she possibly know that would make things more complicated than they already were? He stepped out of the car, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The night air was crisp, and the faint hum of the city was the only sound he could hear. As he approached the cafe, he saw Emma sitting alone at a corner table, her head down, fiddling with her phone. When she looked up, her face immediately hardened as she saw David approaching. She waved him over, but there was a visible tension in her body. David sat down across from her, watching her closely. There was something different about her tonight, something in her eyes, a hint of fear he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't her usual composed self. "You said you had more to tell me," David began, his voice low. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for what she might say. Emma looked around nervously before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "David, I've been trying to help you, but you need to understand. There are things going on that go far beyond what you think. You're in deeper than you realize. And I've been trying to protect you, but I can't anymore. I've already said too much." David leaned in, his voice firm. "Emma, I need you to be clear with me.
What are you talking about?
Who's behind all this? You said there are people at the top who—" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be standing there. David followed her gaze, but the cafe was empty, the only sounds coming from the soft clink of cups and the murmur of distant voices. "I can't say names," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But they're higher up than you think. People in positions of power. People who've been pulling the strings for years. And I don't know how much longer I can keep helping you." David felt a chill spread through him. "What do you mean? Are you saying they know about us? About what we're planning?" Emma nodded slowly. "They know everything. You've been too close to the truth for too long. They've been watching you, waiting for you to make a move. And now that you're close, they won't let you walk away. You have to stop. If you don't, they'll come for you." David's heart was pounding in his chest. "I can't stop now. I can't just walk away from this." Emma looked at him with desperation in her eyes. "I'm telling you this for your own good. If you keep pushing, they'll come after you and your father. And it won't be just your job on the line. It'll be your life. You'll be a target, David." David shook his head, unwilling to accept her warning. "I won't let them win. I won't let them destroy everything my father and I have worked for." Emma reached across the table and grabbed his hand, her grip tight. "Please, David. They're not just trying to take the company. They're trying to silence you. They won't hesitate to do whatever it takes." David pulled his hand away from hers, his mind racing. He couldn't let fear dictate his next steps. He'd already come too far to back down. But he had to admit that Emma's words were starting to sink in. The danger was real. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about the people he was up against. He had only seen the surface, the racism, the corruption, but the truth was far deeper than he could have imagined. "What are they going to do?" David asked, his voice tight. Emma glanced over her shoulder once more before lowering her voice to barely a whisper. "They won't just fire you. They'll ruin you. They'll make sure you and your father have no way out. They'll make sure your name is tarnished beyond repair. Your father won't be able to protect you. He's already too deep in it." David's mind reeled. The people behind this were powerful, ruthless. They didn't just want control of the company. They wanted to destroy anyone who threatened their grip. David had known it would be dangerous, but this was different. This wasn't just about taking down a few bad actors. This was a war, and he and his father were the targets. "I need to get out of here," David said, standing up abruptly. His chest felt tight, and he could barely breathe as the reality of the situation pressed down on him. "Thanks for the warning, Emma, but I can't let this go." "I won't." Emma grabbed his arm as he turned to leave. "David, please. Think about it. You're not just fighting them. You're fighting something much bigger. You don't know who you're dealing with. The people at the top are connected to things you can't even begin to understand. They're untouchable." David pulled away from her grip, his determination unwavering. "I have to know the truth. I can't let it go. I have to expose them." Emma's face twisted in pain, but she didn't stop him. "I wish you would listen, David. I really do. But I can't keep helping you. You're on your own now." David didn't look back as he walked out of the cafe, the door closing softly behind him. His mind was racing, but he didn't slow down. He had to get to the bottom of this. The company, the racism, the corruption. His father's involvement. The leak. Everything. As he walked through the dark streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed again. His senses were on high alert, but he couldn't see anyone. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was no one there. Just shadows. He pulled his phone from his pocket, determined to reach his father and tell him what Emma had said. But before he could dial the number, his screen flickered and then went black. He tried pressing the buttons, but the phone remained dead. No calls. No texts. No messages. It was like his entire world had just disappeared. David stopped walking, his breath catching in his throat. Something was wrong. Something bigger than he could understand. He had to get home, and he had to get there fast. The sense of being watched was now a physical weight on his chest, and he had to get out of the streets. As he rushed toward his car, he glanced over his shoulder again. This time, he saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the corner. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching him. David's heart pounded. He knew this was no coincidence. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. And David realized with a sinking feeling that the people behind the threats had finally found him. David's heart hammered in his chest as he quickened his pace, his eyes glued to the figure standing just out of clear sight. The shadows around the corner had swallowed the person whole, but the unsettling stillness of their presence made it clear they were watching him. Every instinct screamed at him to move faster, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The phone still dead in his hand, the weight of the situation pressing down on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He finally reached his car, the keys cold in his palm as he unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. His fingers trembled as he started the engine, the sound of the car roaring to life filling the silence. He looked in the rearview mirror but saw nothing. No one was following him. But that didn't ease the panic gnawing at his insides. His mind raced, the words Emma had told him echoing in his thoughts. They know everything. You're getting too close. They'll come for you. The fear that had taken root earlier seemed to grow with every passing second. He had come to a grim realization. Emma's warnings weren't just empty threats. He wasn't just in danger. He was being hunted. The shadowy figures, the warnings, the sudden malfunction of his phone, all of it pointed to something larger than he could comprehend. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. He drove through the darkened streets, his eyes darting in the rearview mirror every few seconds. He didn't dare drive home, not now. His apartment no longer felt like a safe haven, it felt like a trap. His mind was spinning with possibilities. Who had been following him? Was it someone connected to the leak in the company? Or was it someone sent by the people at the top to silence him before he could do any more damage? David pulled into a quiet alleyway near a friend's apartment building. He parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the empty street in front of him. The night felt like it was closing in on him, and he knew he couldn't just sit here, paralyzed by fear. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Just then, his phone buzzed again. His heart skipped a beat as he looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a second before answering. David, a familiar voice said from the other end. It was his father. Dad? What's going on? Are you okay? The CEO's voice was tense, urgent. David, you need to listen to me very carefully. They know. They know what we're planning. And it's not just the company at risk anymore. It's our lives. I can't protect you if you keep pushing forward. David's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? I've been followed, Dad. I've been getting threats, and I can feel the walls closing in. They're onto me. They know what we're doing. I know, David. I've been trying to shield you from the truth, but the deeper we go, the more dangerous it gets. I didn't want to drag you into this mess. But now that you're in it, his father's voice trailed off, and David could hear the weight of regret in his tone. They've been watching you from the start. You're not just up against the corruption in the company anymore. You're up against a powerful network. People who won't hesitate to make you disappear if they think you're a threat. David's mind raced. A powerful network? His father wasn't just talking about a group of corrupt executives. This was something much bigger. It was becoming clear that the fight for control of the company was only the tip of the iceberg. What had started as a battle for fairness had turned into something far darker. "You've got to stop, David," his father continued, his voice almost pleading now. "Go into hiding. Get away from here. They'll stop at nothing to silence us." David's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I can't stop."
Not now.
"I'm so close, Dad. I just need a little more time." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before his father finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "I know you think you're close, David, but you need to understand something. If you don't stop now, it won't just be your career on the line. They'll make sure you never walk away from this. I've seen it happen before. You'll be caught in their web, and you won't get out." David closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his father's words. This wasn't just a company scandal. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about their lives. And his father's warning rang loud and clear. If he didn't stop now, there would be no escape. But deep down, David knew he couldn't back down. He had come too far. The truth had to come out. The people responsible for the system of lies and injustice couldn't be allowed to win.
Not now.
"I can't just walk away, Dad," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I can't let them get away with it." There was silence on the other end of the line, and David could almost hear the weight of his father's heavy sigh. "You're right. But you need to be careful. And you need to act fast. They've been planning this for longer than we know. They've got people everywhere, David. You're not just fighting for the company. You're fighting for your life. If you want to survive, you have to stay 2 steps ahead of them. Understand?" David swallowed hard. "I understand, Dad. I'll be careful. I won't stop. I promise." "Good luck, David," his father said quietly before the call abruptly ended. David sat there for a few moments, staring at the dark street ahead. His father's warning echoed in his mind. This was no longer just about exposing racism or corruption. It was about survival. And it was clear now that the stakes had been raised. He couldn't trust anyone, not even his closest allies. The people who had been helping him, the people he thought he could count on, could be working for the other side. Every step he took now had to be calculated. Every move had to be strategic. He had to find out who was behind this, who the leak really was, and who was pulling the strings. And he couldn't do it alone. But the question was, who could he trust? Could he still rely on Emma? Or had she been part of the game all along? David wiped his face with his hand and took a deep breath. The time for hesitation was over. The fight was far from over, and it was time to push forward. But now every decision carried life or death consequences. With a final glance around the empty street, David drove away into the night. The shadows closing in around him once more, the night felt unnaturally quiet as David drove through the winding streets, his thoughts a tangled mess of warnings and danger. Every light that flickered, every turn he took, felt like a decision that could either save him or trap him. He had never imagined his fight for justice would lead him down a path where every step felt like it was taking him closer to a nightmare. But now, with his father's warning fresh in his mind, David knew there was no turning back. As he passed the familiar streets of the city, his eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone trailing him. The silence was suffocating, the weight of the danger pressing in from all sides. He couldn't afford to be followed again. He had to stay ahead, had to figure out who could be trusted and who might be the enemy. David had no clear plan, but his instinct told him to head for the one place where he could think clearly, his old office at the company. It was where everything had started, where the path to exposing the truth had begun. But it also held painful memories, memories of betrayal, racism, and corruption that had festered in the very walls of the company. The office felt like a battlefield now, one he couldn't leave behind. He drove there in a haze, the headlights illuminating the path in front of him. When he finally arrived, he parked the car far away from the entrance, so he wouldn't be seen. The building was dark, its windows staring back at him like silent witnesses to the chaos that had consumed his life. He checked his phone again, still no messages from Emma. He had been trying to reach her, to get her to tell him more about the powerful network behind the corruption. But she had gone silent. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find here, maybe clues, maybe answers. But as he stood in front of the building, something about it felt different. The usual hum of activity in the office was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. It was as if the building itself knew that something was about to break, something big. David stepped inside through the back entrance, his footsteps echoing in the dark. He moved quietly, his eyes scanning the shadows. The corridors were empty, but the faint sound of a door creaking open caught his attention. He froze, his heart racing. Someone was here. He moved cautiously down the hall, the dim lights above casting long shadows on the walls. When he reached the corner, he stopped. He could hear hushed voices coming from a nearby room. He crept closer, instinctively pressing himself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. From the crack in the door, he saw two figures. One was a man he didn't recognize, but the other was unmistakable. Mr. Thompson, the manager who had fired him. David's blood ran cold as he watched them speak, their words muffled but urgent. He could only catch snippets, but it was enough to make his stomach drop. "He's getting too close," the unfamiliar man said. "We need to handle this before it blows up in our faces." "Do what you need to do," Mr. Thompson's voice answered, cold and steely. "But make sure it's clean. I don't want anyone to know what's really going on. If he gets wind of anything..." David didn't wait to hear more. His legs carried him instinctively down the hallway, his mind racing. His heart was pounding in his ears as he moved as quickly as he could, staying low to avoid being seen. If they knew what he was doing, if they knew he was here, he would be a sitting duck. As he rounded the corner and moved toward the exit, he bumped into something, or rather, someone. The impact sent him crashing to the floor, knocking the wind out of him. He scrambled to his feet, only to be met by the sharp eyes of a man standing over him. It was another one of the senior executives, a man David had worked with for years. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his stance told David everything he needed to know. "You shouldn't be here," the executive said, his voice low and warning. "You're not welcome." David took a step back, adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. He could feel the walls closing in on him, could feel the noose tightening around his neck. They knew. They knew everything. "I'm not leaving until I get the truth," David said, his voice firm. His fear was still there, but it was buried beneath the urgency to finish what he'd started. The executive smirked, his expression hardening. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you. It's about the system. You've been digging in places you shouldn't. And now you've put yourself and your family at risk." David's mind flashed to his father's warning, to Emma's words, to the threats that had come from every angle. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. "I'm going to expose everything," David said, his voice shaking with resolve. "No matter what it costs me." The executive didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made David's stomach turn. A gun. David froze, his mind scrambling for a way out. He couldn't run now, not without being caught. He had to stay calm, had to think. The gun in the man's hand was a clear sign that the stakes were higher than ever. "Get up," the executive ordered. "We're going to take a little walk. You're going to come with me. If you don't, I can promise you it'll be the last walk you ever take." David's eyes darted around, looking for any way out. His chest tightened as the executive took a step forward, the gun glinting in the dim light. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch in the gut. He had underestimated how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. "I'm not going anywhere with you," David said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But the executive's smile was cold, merciless. "Oh, you don't have a choice in the matter," he said, moving closer. David didn't wait for the next move. Without thinking, he bolted. He ran, his footsteps echoing through the hallway, his heart thumping in his chest. The executive's angry shouts echoed behind him, but David kept running. The weight of the gun, the fear of being caught, pushed him forward. He burst through the back exit, slamming the door behind him, and didn't stop running until he reached his car. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with the keys, his breath ragged and fast. He didn't look back. Not this time. Not until he was far away. As he sped off into the night, David realized that he was no longer just fighting for the truth. He was fighting for his life. And there was no turning back now. The game had changed completely, and the price of exposing the corruption in the company was becoming far steeper than he had ever imagined. The only question left was whether he would survive long enough to bring it all to light. David's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. He was still shaken by the encounter in the hallway, the gun in the executive's hand lingering in his mind. But the fear didn't slow him down. It fueled him. There was no turning back now. No more playing it safe. No more second-guessing. He needed answers. And he needed to expose the people behind the web of lies that had been controlling the company for so long. But it was bigger than that now. They had tried to silence him, tried to intimidate him into submission, but he wasn't going to let them. They had underestimated him, and they were about to learn just how dangerous it was to cross someone who had nothing left to lose. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat, when he saw the name on the screen. It was Emma. He quickly answered, his voice shaky but determined. Emma? David, listen to me. You're in even more danger than you realize. Emma's voice came through, panicked and urgent. They know you're onto them. The people you're dealing with, they're ruthless. They won't stop until they destroy everything you've been working for. You need to be careful. You can't trust anyone. David's grip on the wheel tightened. I know, Emma. But I'm not stopping. I've come too far to back down now. I'm going to expose them. Emma hesitated. David, it's not just about the company anymore. They know everything about you. About your father. They'll use him against you if they have to. I don't want to see you get hurt. Please, you have to be smarter than this. David's mind flashed back to his father's warning. He remembered the look in his father's eyes, the fear behind his calm facade. David knew his father was trying to protect him, but the truth was bigger than either of them could have imagined. I have to do this, David said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. I can't let them get away with it. Not after everything they've done. I'm going to take them down, Emma. One way or another. There was a long pause before Emma spoke again, her voice soft but full of fear. Just promise me something, David. Promise me you'll be careful. Don't trust anyone. Not even me. They're everywhere. David's heart ached at her words, but he knew she was right. He couldn't trust anyone. The people he had worked with for years, the people he had called friends, they could all be involved in this. He was completely alone now, walking a dangerous path with no allies left. I'll be careful, David said, though part of him knew it wouldn't be enough. The truth was dangerous. The truth would cost him more than he was willing to pay. But he couldn't stop. Not now. I'll meet you at the usual spot tomorrow night, Emma said, her voice shaking. If you don't show up, I'll know it's over. Be safe, David. David hung up the phone, his mind racing. He had to get back to the office. He had to dig deeper, find more evidence, expose the corruption at the highest level. But the fear that had been gnawing at him for weeks now seemed more real than ever. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. As he drove back toward the city, his thoughts kept returning to the figure he had seen earlier, Mr. Thompson, the executive who had fired him, and the strange man he had been talking to. That conversation hadn't been about a simple firing. It had been about something far more sinister. They were afraid of him. They knew what he was capable of. And that fear meant they would do anything to stop him. The sky overhead darkened, the streets growing more desolate as David approached the heart of the city. He knew he had to get to the bottom of this. He had to find the leak, expose the network that had been controlling everything from the shadows. But how much farther could he push before it all came crashing down? As he pulled into the parking garage of the company building, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. Every move he made was being watched. Every decision was being tracked. And soon, the people behind the scenes would be closing in. David stepped out of the car, his pulse racing. He glanced around, but the parking garage was empty. He walked quickly toward the elevator, his steps echoing in the silence. When the doors opened, he stepped inside and pressed the button for the top floor, where the company's highest executives worked. The ride up felt like an eternity. The tension in his body grew with each passing second, the air thick with the weight of what was coming. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew it was going to change everything. The doors opened with a soft chime, and David stepped out into the quiet hallway. His heart was pounding in his chest as he moved toward the large double doors that led into the executive offices. He paused just outside the doors, taking a deep breath. This was it. He pushed the doors open. The room was dark, the lights dimmed, but he could see the silhouettes of the people inside. His eyes immediately locked onto the figure standing at the head of the table, the CEO, his father. David's heart skipped a beat as he stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper.
Dad.
The CEO's head snapped up, his eyes widening with shock. David, what are you doing here? Before David could respond, the door behind him slammed shut, and he turned just in time to see the figures of several armed men stepping into the room. The trap had been set.
Dad.
David shouted, his voice full of panic. What is this? What's going on? The CEO's face was a mask of cold indifference. I'm sorry, David, but this is the only way. You've put us all at risk. David felt a sickening realization settle in his stomach. His father had known all along. He had been a part of the conspiracy, a pawn in the larger game. And now, David had nowhere left to run. As the armed men moved toward him, David realized just how much he had underestimated the forces working against him. This wasn't just a fight for the truth anymore. It was a fight for survival. And in the end, the truth might cost him everything.